So from the previous lecture, we know that Wagner's hypothesis, moving these plates around and making them fit together to explain some of the other evidences he was seeing, was not very well accepted at the time, and a mechanism for this plate tectonics is really what was missing from his explanation. So we're going to talk through the mechanisms of how these plates can move like folks didn't want to believe. A note on textbooks, it looks like that those of you who have chosen a textbook have either gone with the Johnson text or the Lumen, so I took a deeper look at those two. And I'm not as fond of the Lumen so far. It's harder for me to find things in it, but I like a physical text with an index, with a good index, so there's that. The Johnson text has good links and stuff, and I'm able to find things a little better in it. I'm going to try to use both of those, and then there are some number of y'all who have not chosen a textbook at all, so I'm just going to go with these two that folks did choose. So back to the mechanisms idea and looking for the basic science underneath it. So wherever y'all's careers lead, I think most of you are not hard science majors, so you may be looking at this from another perspective as a business leader or a politician, or who knows where your life might lead. Just know that when we scientists are pushing for effort, money, whatever, to try to understand the basic science behind things, this is the kind of thing we're looking for. It's the mechanisms that underlie, so that we can really understand what's going on. An analogy might be that the hard scientist isn't looking to build a better cell phone. That's the engineer's job. We're looking to understand the basic principles that govern how those things act, how they work, so that whatever comes, we don't know what that is, whatever comes after cell phones can happen because we understood the basic science of it. So Wagner's hypothesis lacked a clear mechanism. He was thinking in terms of the continents being like blocks of granite that slid across the seafloors. It doesn't really work like that, and the fact that he couldn't explain the nuts and bolts of it, the actual how it could do that, was a big barrier. And some of you guys are mentioning some other barriers. It's really good in the discussion on that. Time period may fall into it. Somebody in the discussions mentioned the politics, and that's kind of neat. So Wagner is German, and this is the time period of World War I. So I wonder if that could be some of the stuff, if you have political teamism working into whether or not some of this gets accepted or not. So not just sliding across a seafloor. So how could this work then? So we need to think toward the structure stuff that we looked at before back in lecture 2. We looked at this diagram back in lecture 2 with a slice out of the planet and looking at the different layers. Also, there was discussion of where the asthenosphere is in those layers, and I stuck that into that quiz in lecture 2, and I think a fair number of folks misplaced where the asthenosphere is. So you might want to go back to lecture 2 and look at that. It's going to be kind of important. You've got the lithosphere. Let me highlight this. I think I can highlight with this thing. So you've got the lithosphere up here at the top, right? And then you've got, let's do a nice fiery red color, right? Then you've got the core and the solid parts of the mantle. Down here is the lower solid mantle, and then the transition, which is solid-ish, pretty solid. And then we've got this right here in between a asthenosphere. And that's the word here is ductile. part. It is malleable, another term for how we can change the shape of a solid-ish material. So remember back when I talked about the different states of matter and how we can't, in a geologic framework, be so clear that solids retain their shape. Kind of like the iron that I mentioned, and you can hammer it into a different shape. It's not perfectly rigid. Well, the asthenosphere is less rigid than the stuff around it and more able to flow. And that flow is what's really important here. Okay, so our asthenosphere can flow. And consider the idea of a convection cell. So there is a link down here if you want to look at how convection works. It's a fairly simple link and has some relation to the circulation on the planet. I'll mention that I have a couple of problems with some details in the video. The ocean currents don't work like they're set up here. They're not exactly density driven. There are density currents, thermohaline circulations, but that's not what's shown in that video. Most of the circulation there is due to those Hadley cells in the atmosphere and constant wind across the surface of the ocean driving those surface currents. Anyway, that's a little deeper than we need to go for this. Just know that it's a slight problem in that, but the idea of convection is well done in that YouTube video. Okay, so let's talk about that, what I here call plasticky asthenosphere. And I thought of another analogy for it. If you have ever mixed concrete, think about a mix with just barely enough water in it for you to mix with it, so that it's really, really hard to get the shovel in there. And you can mix it. It's just, it would be a lot easier with more water. So that's kind of the thing I'm reaching for here, is the asthenosphere will move, at least on a geologic terms, time frame, but it doesn't just flow easily like a liquid. So that could be important when we think about the time and the mechanism of drag on the bottom of the plates. So plates, what are these plates? A lithospheric plate. So the I guess official, USGS is about as official as we get in geology. Definition is a tectonic plate is a massive irregularly shaped slab of solid rock generally composed of both continental and oceanic lithosphere. Okay, so lithosphere, so that means that it extends down to the asthenosphere, that diagram we were talking about. And what they are is essentially fractured, brittle outer part of the planet. Remember back from lecture 2 how thin this lithosphere is that we're talking about. So you can think of a hard-boiled egg, and if you crack the shell, right? So you have those little thin pieces of shell on the surface of that egg, but in this case they can slide across that surface just a little bit. But those chunks, and they're very irregular, those are your crust plates. So they do things, they move, and it turns out we can even possibly lose them. They can slide all the way up underneath the other plates. There's a link here about one under Europe, and then here's another one that we're currently losing under California. And then just this week, there's a new article out about how the oceanic plate it's in the Indian Ocean off of Australia. It's starting to crack into, it looks like. So there's a news article here running down. I haven't run down the peer-reviewed article that the news article might be referencing. They're not real clear about where it is, but I thought it was a neat talk about, look, even the ones we know now are breaking, and there's more fragmenting to come. Here's that Australian plate that's probably cracking somewhere off here. It may be on the 938 ridge. I haven't really tracked it down to see where yet, but they're different places that it could be cracking. There's some different zones where there's some ridges out there. So that's the one that article is about. Let's look at some of these different plates. These are kind of commonly recognized plates. So the Antarctic plate, of course, is not as big as it shows on here. This is a distortion because of the flat plane projection. So you have some plates, like the Pacific plate and the Nazca plate, that are almost all covered by water. Of course, you have island chains like Hawaii here. But that's mostly all oceanic plate. But then you have other things, like here's the South American plate. So the South American plate does include the continental crust that's exposed as the continent of South America, but it also extends out here. So this whole purpled region is the South American plate, from west of the Andes Mountains here all the way out into the Atlantic Ocean, out to this ridge. And if you've heard about the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, we can trace it along the plate boundary up through here between the South American and African plates, and then also between the North American and African plates and the North American and the Eurasian plates here. That ridge goes all the way up through there and actually is nicely exposed across Iceland with some of the highest volcanic activities in the world. So let's look at a cross-section across that, and I hope that this looks somewhat familiar from the lab that we just finished with the profile. So this is kind of making the same idea of a elevation profile. Now in this case, your elevations get below sea level and you've got water sitting on top of it, but the idea of that topography trace works the same as what you created and turned in for Lab 3. So looking at the details of this, it turns out that, let's see, let's start the highlighter, I think. It turns out that a lot of the ocean bottom is kind of flat, and we call it an abyssal plain. And if you look on naval charts, you can find abyssal plains listed. They're these long, empty, flat areas at the bottom of the oceans. So then we're going to talk a fair bit about the ridge systems in the middle and how you get a buildup right here in the middle, and we'll talk about what's going on underneath with the magma generation at the spreading center. Another thing that you can see on this map are the trenches. And you've probably heard about the Challenger Deep, the deep trenches in the ocean. Well, what's going on there, and we'll talk about this under convergent, is you have this plate probably is sliding down underneath this other plate over here so that it's subducting underneath, and that's why you get this drag down and this trench developing. Some of the deepest places on the planet are like that. And then finally, let's talk about this area right here. So up on top here you have the continental margin, and then I guess out here to the side, let's get another color, we'd have the actual exposed continent up there. So that here's where your dry land is up here, right? But the continent extends out well beyond that. You have what at a lower sea level would be exposed land. We find some archaeological stuff out there sometimes. It's really neat how you can find stuff that's well underwater that was created by older peoples from long ago, but it was exposed land at the time. And then you get this quick drop-off to those depths and the abyssal plain. And so in this case, if I were to label what is a continent here, so I would definitely split it right here and say that that is one continent and that is a separate continent. And then actually you could make a division here and say that this is a third continent. So we could have pieces of 3 different continents exposed in this diagram. And we're going to talk about 3 different types of plate boundaries. We're going to look at the way the plates are moving relative to each other, right? And so we're going to either look at divergent boundaries, where the plates are moving apart from one another, or convergent boundaries, where the plates are moving into each other, crashing into each other, or transform boundaries, where they are essentially sliding past each other. Of course, the real dynamics of that are not that simple, but we're going to try to group everything into these 3 categories for right now and leave the more complex stuff for later courses.